The glow of our bedside lamp was the only light in the room, casting soft shadows along the walls. The scent of old book pages mixed with the faint aroma of Ethan's cologne, a fragrance that had become as familiar to me as the rhythm of my own breathing. Every night, we lay side by side, sharing a book between us, our heads just close enough that I could hear his quiet inhales as he read each passage. This had been our tradition for years. When my dad remarried and I suddenly gained a stepmother and an 18-year-old stepbrother, I hadn't expected that I'd be sharing a room with him. But our house wasn't big, and after countless debates about sleeping arrangements, it had been decided Ethan and I would make do. At first, it had been awkward. The space was too small, the boundaries too blurred. The first few nights, I slept rigidly, barely turning in my bed, hyper-aware of the quiet sounds of Ethan breathing just a few feet away. But gradually, we fell into an unspoken rhythm. He wasn't intrusive, never overstepped. He kept to his side, and I kept to mine. Then one evening, he casually pulled out a book he'd been reading and asked if I wanted to listen. That was the beginning of everything. We had always been quiet around each other, unsure of how to navigate this newfound siblinghood forced upon us. But the books gave us a language of our own. Through them, we found comfort, a space that was ours alone. "Are you still awake?" Ethan's voice was soft as he turned the page. I hummed in response, shifting slightly under the covers. "Ma'am!" His voice dipped lower as he continued reading, the words weaving through the quiet like a spell. I watched his profile from where I lay, my gaze tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the way his lips moved over each syllable. His voice had a way of pulling me in, making the rest of the world disappear. I didn't realize how much I had come to crave these moments. It was different from anything I had known before. There was something intimate about sharing stories in the hush of the night, something that felt deeper than mere habit. I caught myself memorizing the way his fingers ghosted over the book's spine, how he would tilt his head slightly when a passage intrigued him. And then there were the nights when he would pause between sentences, glancing at me, as if waiting for me to say something, as if he knew I was watching, as if he was watching too. I closed my eyes, trying to push the thought away. This was just our tradition, nothing more. But some nights, when the silence between pages stretched too long and the air in the room felt heavier than usual, I wasn't so sure. The book lay open between us, its spine bent, its pages soft from use. But neither of us was reading anymore. I could hear Ethan breathing beside me, slow and steady, the faint rise and fall of his chest visible in the dim glow of the lamp. His fingers still rested on the edge of the page, unmoving. He hadn't turned it in a while. Neither of us spoke, and yet the silence wasn't empty. It was thick, charged. I swallowed, suddenly too aware of the closeness between us. This wasn't unusual. We had spent countless nights like this, side by side, whispering words to each other in the dark. But something felt different tonight. I could feel it in the way Ethan's body tensed ever so slightly when I shifted under the covers, in the way his fingers brushed against mine when he reached to adjust the book. A touch so fleeting it could have been nothing, or everything. My pulse quickened, but I kept my eyes trained on the book, pretending to read even as the words blurred together. "Are you tired?" His voice was softer than usual. "No," I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. Ethan hesitated, his fingers tracing the crease in the page. "You seem different tonight." I turned my head to look at him. "Different how?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know." His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I felt like we weren't just step-siblings lying in the same room, bound together by circumstance. I felt seen. I felt noticed. And I didn't know what to do with that. I shifted under the blanket, suddenly restless. "We should keep reading," I murmured, hoping to break whatever spell had settled over us. Ethan studied me for a moment longer before nodding. But as he turned back to the book, I saw it, the flicker of hesitation, the unspoken weight of whatever it was he wasn't saying. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The nights that followed felt different. Nothing changed, not in any obvious way. We still read together, still fell asleep with a book resting between us. And yet, everything felt altered. I noticed him more. The way he stretched in the mornings, his t-shirt lifting just slightly over his waist. The way he bit his lip in concentration when he read something particularly gripping. And I could feel him noticing me too. His glances lingered. His voice softened when he spoke my name. When I laughed, he looked at me like he wanted to memorize the sound. One evening, as we sat cross-legged on the bed, the book balanced between us, Ethan reached for the page at the same time I did. Our hands brushed. It should have been nothing. We touched all the time. A casual nudge here, a fleeting graze there. But this time, neither of us pulled away. His fingers stayed against mine, warm and unmoving. I didn't breathe. Neither did he. For a moment, we just sat there, frozen in place. The air between us buzzed with something unfamiliar, something I wasn't ready to name. Ethan swallowed, his throat bobbing. "Sorry," he said, but he didn't move his hand. I didn't move mine either. It was as if we were waiting for something, or daring the other to be the first to pull away. My heart pounded, so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The weight of the book between us suddenly felt insignificant, a flimsy barrier against something much heavier. I licked my lips, my throat dry. "It's okay." His eyes flicked to my mouth for the briefest second before he exhaled sharply and pulled his hand back. The book shifted. The moment broke. But something had changed, and we both knew it. From then on, our nights became quieter. Not because we stopped talking, but because there was more unsaid between us than before. The tension was always there now, in the way our knees accidentally touched under the blankets, in the way our hands hovered near each other just a second too long when passing the book. One night, Ethan leaned back against the headboard, stretching his arms behind his head. "Do you ever think about how weird it is?" I looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "How weird what is?" "That we ended up in the same room," he said, his gaze unreadable. "That we had to learn how to live around each other so fast." I shrugged. "I guess. But it's normal now, right?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, so softly I almost missed it, he said, "Yeah, normal." Except nothing felt normal anymore. Not when I could feel his eyes on me when he thought I wasn't looking. Not when I could hear the way his breathing changed when I moved too close. Not when I could still feel the ghost of his fingers against mine, lingering long after the book had been closed. That night, I turned off the lamp, rolling onto my side. Ethan did the same, his back to me, the silence stretching between us. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but I could still feel it. The space between us. The space that wasn't really space at all. And it was getting smaller every day. That evening, Ethan walked into our shared room with a book tucked under his arm. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he hesitated before speaking that made my stomach tighten. "I got a new book," he said casually, tossing it onto the bed between us. I glanced down, expecting something fantasy or thriller, the genres we usually gravitated toward. But when I saw the title, my breath caught. Forbidden Love. I swallowed. My eyes flicked up to his face, but he wasn't looking at me. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, fingers loosely laced together, staring at the book as if he wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. I picked it up, running my fingers over the cover. The title alone made my chest feel tight. This isn't like what we usually read. Ethan shrugged, but I caught the slight tension in his shoulders. I thought it'd be interesting. Something in his voice made my skin prickle. I opened the book, flipping to a random page. The words stared back at me, thick with longing, tension, hesitation. A story about two people drawn to each other despite every reason they shouldn't be. I snapped the book shut. Ethan finally looked at me, something unreadable in his expression. "Do you want to read it?" I should have said no. I should have laughed it off, called him out for picking something so different from our usual choices. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, my fingers tightening around the book's spine. He shifted against his pillows, waiting. I took a steadying breath, then opened to the first page and began to read. The words poured from my lips, filling the small space between us. The story unfolded slowly, painting a world where love was not meant to be, where stolen moments held more weight than any grand declaration. I wasn't sure how long I had been reading before I noticed it. Ethan wasn't just listening. He was watching me. I kept my eyes trained on the pages, pretending not to notice, but the weight of his gaze was impossible to ignore. His breathing was slower now, more controlled. Every so often, when I turned a page, I felt his fingers twitch on the bed beside me, as if resisting the urge to reach out. My voice wavered on certain lines about lingering glances, about hands brushing in the dark, about words left unsaid between two people who knew they were standing too close to a line they weren't supposed to cross. I felt my throat go dry. Ethan shifted beside me, leaning closer. "Keep going," he murmured. I turned the page. By the time we stopped for the night, the room felt different. Neither of us spoke. The book lay between us, open but unread, the words echoing in my mind long after I had closed my mouth. I glanced at Ethan. He was staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight, his fingers clenched in the blanket. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. But before I could, he turned to face me. "Did you like it?" I hesitated. "Yeah, it was intense." He gave a short laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah." A silence stretched between us, the kind that wasn't empty, but full. I cleared my throat, trying to sound normal. "Same time tomorrow." Ethan's eyes met mine, something dark flickering behind them. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Same time tomorrow." The next night, we picked up where we left off. And the night after that. And the night after that. Each time, the air between us grew heavier, the silences between words more meaningful. The way we sat changed, too. We used to keep our distance, each staying on our own side of the bed. Now, our knees brushed beneath the covers, our shoulders touched when I leaned over to show him something on the page. It wasn't intentional. At least, that's what I told myself. But then one night, I turned a page, and Ethan didn't pull his hand away in time. Our fingers overlapped. Neither of us moved. The warmth of his skin seeped into mine, the contact so small yet so loud in the quiet of the room. I swallowed hard, but my hand remained where it was. So did his. The book was forgotten. The only thing I could focus on was the press of his fingertips against mine, the way neither of us was willing to pull away first. Seconds stretched. Then, slowly, so slowly it felt deliberate, Ethan curled his pinky around mine. A silent acknowledgement. A line crossed in the smallest, quietest way. I felt my pulse hammer in my throat. I could have pulled away. I should have, but I didn't. Instead, I let my pinky tighten around his in return. We sat there, our hands barely touching, our breaths shallow, the space between us smaller than it had ever been. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Everything had already been said between the lines. The book lay open, but neither of us was reading anymore. The story had been building to a pivotal moment, the characters standing too close, their breath mingling, their hands brushing in a way that felt anything but accidental. The words sat on the page, but they might as well have been written in the air between us, thick with something neither of us dared to name. Ethan was quiet beside me. He hadn't turned the page in minutes. I could feel it, the way his body had gone still, the way his fingers twitched every so often like he was holding something back. Or deciding something. I forced myself to focus on the book, on the lines in front of me. But then Ethan shifted. His weight pressed slightly into the mattress, and before I could register what was happening, I felt it. His hand. It covered mine, warm and sure, his fingers slipping between mine with careful, deliberate ease. A breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I should have pulled away, should have laughed it off, made a joke, done anything to remind us that we weren't the characters in the story. But I didn't. I just sat there, my hand in his, feeling the way his palm fit against mine, the way his fingers curled gently like he was afraid I might slip away if he held too tight. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, I turned my head to look at him. Ethan was already watching me. His expression was unreadable, his blue eyes darker than usual in the dim glow of our bedside lamp. His gaze flickered down, to our hands, still clasped between us, then back up to my face. His fingers tightened ever so slightly. Something in my chest squeezed. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it didn't matter. All I knew was that, suddenly, the space between us wasn't space at all. His forehead brushed mine, soft and hesitant, like he was giving me time to stop this before it went any further. I didn't stop him. His breath was warm, mingling with mine. Then, with the lightest pressure, his lips touched mine. It was barely a kiss, just a soft press, so hesitant it could have been a mistake. But it wasn't. It was careful, testing, a silent question. I answered it by pressing back. For a second, we stayed like that, lips barely touching, hands still entwined, the air around us thick with something unspoken. Then Ethan pulled back. Just an inch. Just enough to search my eyes in the dim light, his own expression open, uncertain. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I didn't have to. I squeezed his hand just slightly. The smallest answer. Ethan exhaled softly, his fingers brushing over mine in response, like he understood exactly what I meant. No words. No explanations. Just this moment. Just us. The days that followed were different. The book stayed on the nightstand, untouched. We didn't need it anymore. Not when the story we had been reading had bled into reality, into the way his hand lingered against mine as we passed each other in the hallway, into the way his eyes found mine at the dinner table when no one else was paying attention. Into the way, at night, when we lay in our separate beds, the silence between us wasn't empty but full of everything we couldn't say. One night, I turned off my bedside lamp and lay in the dark, my heart beat a quiet drum against the silence. Then I heard it, the rustle of sheets, soft footsteps, a quiet hesitation. Then the bed dipped beside me. Neither of us spoke as Ethan lay down next to me, close enough that I could feel his warmth through the blankets. His hand found mine under the covers. I turned my head, finding the shape of his face in the dark. This time, there was no hesitation. When his lips found mine again, they were surer. And this time, I kissed him back without question. The darkness wrapped around us, soft and endless, but I wasn't afraid of it. Not when Ethan was this close. His lips brushed against mine again, slow, hesitant, like he was still trying to figure out if this was real. If I would pull away, if I would change my mind. I didn't. Instead, I let myself sink into the moment, my fingers tightening around his where they lay between us. We were still lying side by side, the space between our bodies smaller than it had ever been, the warmth of his breath fanning against my skin. The silence was thick, stretching like an unspoken confession between us. Then Ethan exhaled softly and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded before realizing he probably couldn't see me in the dark. "Yes," I whispered back. A pause. Then, "Me too." His hand shifted, his thumb brushing the inside of my wrist, the smallest, most delicate touch. It sent a shiver through me, one I hoped he didn't notice. I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know what would happen when the sun came up, when the book on our nightstand was just a book again, and we were two people sharing the same space, pretending the air between us wasn't thick with something more. But I didn't want to think about that. Not now. Not when Ethan was still so close. His fingers curled around mine again, and then, without a word, he turned onto his side, pulling me into him just slightly. Not enough to push, not enough to assume. Just enough to let me decide. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't resist. I let myself turn too, my body instinctively fitting against his. It wasn't anything, and yet it was everything. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us saying a word. Somewhere between breaths, I drifted off, the steady sound of his heartbeat lulling me to sleep. The morning light was different. Harsher. Sharper. More real. I woke up before Ethan did. His arm was still draped loosely over me, his fingers curled against my palm like they had never let go, even in sleep. For a moment, I didn't move. I just watched him, the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones, the way his breathing was deep and even. He looked peaceful, but the moment I shifted, his eyes fluttered open. I froze. Ethan blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused at first. Then, as if realizing where he was, he tensed. His arm was still around me. His hand was still holding mine. We both knew what had happened last night, and neither of us had an excuse. I swallowed. Ethan! But before I could say anything, his fingers tightened slightly around mine. "Don't," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. I hesitated. He opened his eyes fully, locking onto mine. "Don't take it back." My breath hitched. I hadn't been planning to. At least, I didn't think I had. Ethan must have seen something in my expression because his hold on me loosened. He exhaled sharply. "I don't know what this is, okay? But I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." His words settled between us, raw and unguarded. Something inside me cracked open. "Me neither," I admitted. The tension in his shoulders eased. Just slightly. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he let his forehead drop against mine. We stayed like that, tangled in the morning light, caught between the past and whatever came next. Neither of us knew where this would lead. But for now, neither of us was letting go.